The C-Class were the last destroyers built for the Royal Navy under the Wartime Emergency Flotilla programme. The previous flotillas had been built in pairs of classes, with each class numbering 8 ships, whereas the C-Class, as originally planned, would have been 34 ships strong, and as built were 32 ships strong, and so they're quite often divided into 4 separate subclasses based on small variations in design. Nonetheless, they were quite notable in as much as being the last emergency flotilla ship, they were also the largest, and they introduced the dual-purpose 4.5-inch gun to the Royal Navy as a whole flotilla. The Z-Class, one half of the previous flotilla, had also had the 4.5-inch gun mounted, but the C-Class were the first full class to have this installed. Whilst it was a dual-purpose weapon, the mounting, the Mark V, still had a limited degree of elevation, which limited its use in the full anti-aircraft role, something that would only be solved with the introduction of the Battle and Daring classes, which for all intents and purposes were post-war ships. The C-Class were pretty quick on their feet, able to reach a maximum speed of 36 knots, and armed with 4 of the aforementioned 4.5-inch guns in single mountings, a pair superfiring forward, a pair superfiring aft, along with a pair of twin 40mm Bofors mounts, and in the first run they would also have 4 single 40mm pom-poms and 2 quadruple torpedo launchers plus depth charges, and in the latter 3 runs they would generally only have a pair of single pom-poms and 2 20mm Oerlikons instead, plus a single quadruple torpedo launcher. The weight saved by removing the other one was then used to allow for the installation of remote power control, or RPC, gun-laying equipment on the 4.5-inch mounts. A few ships slightly varied in this light anti-aircraft loadout, but we're not talking about those specifically today. We're actually focusing on one particular vessel. This is HMS Cavalier. She was one of the 8 ships laid down as part of the CA subdivision of the C-Class, and as such was part of the 11th Emergency Flotilla. Although ordered in 1942, Cavalier's keel wasn't actually laid until February 1943, and she was launched in April 1944 and then commissioned in November 1944. Now, as a result, you might guess, she didn't see a tremendous amount of action. She commissioned into service with the Home Fleet and would take part in a number of operations in the North Sea, operating off of Norway, and occasionally helping out the Arctic convoys. She got her sole battle honour from this particular element of things when she was sent out with 2 other destroyers to reinforce a convoy which had been scattered by a storm and was under German attack. She managed to accomplish this, and between her and her compatriots bring the convoy back home with slightly under 10% of the ships lost. Compared to the disaster that had been PQ-17 a few years earlier, this was quite the achievement. But that was pretty much it for her World War II experience, as by the time all that was said and done, the war itself was actually over. Shortly after the war ended, she was sent over to the British Pacific Fleet and would spend some months out there before returning home in spring 1946, whereupon she was placed into reserve, a place that she would remain for 9 years. However, come the mid-1950s, she was still in pretty good material condition, and having not actually seen much active service, she was a prime candidate for conversion. As such, she spent 2 years being modernised, which meant that she sacrificed her super-firing aft 4.5-inch gun, as well as the aft torpedo tubes, for Squid anti-submarine mortar launchers, along with brand new Mark 6M fire control radar, remote power control for her remaining 3 4.5-inch guns, and a flyplane anti-aircraft fire control suite. She also gained an additional twin 40mm Bofors mount. In this guise, she was sent back out to the Far East, where she was based at Singapore, and then she served as a rather unlikely troop transport, given that she was still, after all, a destroyer, now one specialised in anti-submarine work, taking troops and equipment over to defend the Kingdom of Brunei in 1962. By 1964, she was back home again, and she was now fitted with an enhanced anti-aircraft defence system consisting of an externally mounted quadruple Sea-Cat missile launcher system, which, given their location and weight, is probably around the time she lost her forward torpedo tubes. She would spend the rest of the 1960s bouncing back and forth between the Far East and home, seeing in the 1970s by boarding and rescuing an abandoned Scottish coaster which had caught fire and was about to smash into the Welsh coast, thus netting her and her crew a rather neat salvage award. One of her last acts in Royal Navy service would follow shortly thereafter, when she raced against the frigate HMS Rapid. Rapid had started life as an R-class destroyer, another former wartime emergency flotilla vessel. She'd been more heavily converted than Cavalier by this point, having been converted into a Type 15 anti-submarine frigate. Theoretically, being a slightly smaller ship with the same power plant, Rapid should have been faster, but the additional weight that she'd incurred as a result of her conversion meant that actually the race was neck and neck. After 2 hours of racing in perfect weather, Cavalier and Rapid were basically exchanging the lead by a matter of yards, when all of a sudden one of Rapid's safety valves lifted. Cavalier, on the other hand, didn't suffer this issue, and with a 30-yard lead after a 64-mile race, she came in first place, having averaged 31.8 knots across the entire 64 miles. She would then be decommissioned in 1972 and was laid up ready for disposal. However, as the last surviving World War II era UK destroyer, she was saved after a half-decade-long campaign and handed over to the Cavalier Trust in 1977. However, the next couple of decades were not particularly happy ones for Cavalier. After some reconditioning, she was opened as a memorial ship in Southampton in 1982, but she didn't earn enough to retain her position, and after a year or so, she was moved over to Brighton. Then, after 4 more years, she was moved up to Newcastle on the River Tyne, and it turned out that the council didn't want to spend the money it took to maintain her, and so she wound up sitting in a dry dock for most of the 1990s, rusting quietly away. However, luckily, she was then bought by Chatham Historic Dockyard in 1998 and turned into a museum ship. She was brought into the historic No. 2 dry dock where HMS Victory was built over 250 years ago, and over the course of the late 90s and early 2000s, she was reconditioned and reopened for tours, along with many ex-Cavalier crew coming along to help sort out the internals of the ship. Then in 2007, she was officially designated as the war memorial to the over 100 Royal Navy destroyers that were sunk during World War II and the over 11,000 men who were lost on those ships. Now, some of you may recall I did a video on Chatham Dockyard a few months ago, and as part of that, I was allowed access to Cavalier before the reopening of the dockyard following the relaxation of COVID restrictions, and so I would like to show you briefly around the ship and explain a few more of the features in a bit more detail. Now, as with all tours of ships that I do, there are a few areas that are specifically left out because I want you to be able to go there if at all possible and experience the ship for yourself rather than just seeing it all on screen and thinking, well, that's good enough. Because, of course, if you go and visit the ship, that means the dockyard is supported and she can continue to be a museum ship for many more people to enjoy in future years. But on the flip side is, of course, I will try and include as much as possible, so for those of you who are far overseas and may never make it to the UK, you still get a good idea of what is there. So here she is, and of course there is drone footage, and this is where she sits. She's about halfway through Chatham Historic Dockyard. The entrance is just over there to your right at the moment. You've got Gannet and Ocelot there, then Cavalier, as you can see, and then as we pan round to the left, we've also got the engine shed, the ropery all the way down there, various other historic buildings. One of the engines is out on the day, and as we go back round again, you've got HMS Invincible's Wreck Museum back up there, and a number of other important buildings with very interesting contents. That's the Age of Sail Invincible, by the way. And as you can see, she is one of the 2 ships in a flooded dry dock, so she is still afloat. And as we go down the length of the ship, you can see her 2 forward guns are still there. Some of her radar fit, one of the Bofors is right there, right next to the bridge. Then there's the open space. I'm just hopping over a crane here, where you can see where one of the torpedo launchers would have been. And as we come back, you can see she's got a very thin square lattice mast to support her electronic equipment. And there down on the hull, you can see there are 2 rows of scuttles, or portholes, because of course, as a destroyer, she doesn't have any armour to speak of. You can also see there her superfiring gun has this little ledge that overhangs the lower gun. That protects the lower gun crew from the blast effects, and it also means, hopefully, that someone will have a bit of a clue if they depress the gun too much, that maybe they shouldn't shoot through there. So with that in play, and having adjusted so I don't smash myself into one of the builder's cranes, we're able to go further back. You can see the distinct open bridge style of British wartime destroyers. There's a little tarpaulin over there to make it a little bit more livable for visitors. And then you have the funnel with a nice number 4 on it, the more modern Sea Cat launcher there, the limbo mortars where X-turret would have been, the crane, which is the thing I almost hit earlier, and then the aftmost turret right there at the back. And as you can see, the dry dock is locked up, but the River Medway is just there if anyone happens to want to go in it for some reason. I can't imagine why, but it takes all kinds. Much of this aft superstructure wasn't there when she was originally built. It's all been developed as part of the subsequent refits. And then as we come back forward again, you can see the step up in her hull. So she's not a flush deck destroyer. That step up allows for the bow to be high for seakeeping, whilst keeping the weight down aft. And now we can see what she looks like from above. So there's the forward battery, then the bridge, then the radar, then the mast, amidships. You can see quite clearly where the torpedo launchers would have been, and then all of her aft-mounted weaponry from her later period. And as we come down the other side, you can notice something else that's different about Cavalier compared to many World War II vessels. She doesn't have any teak decking, so just has this green anti-slip, which means you take her to tropical waters, it's going to be a little bit hot down there. Better hope the aircon's working. So with all that said and done, let's head on board. So we're starting off at the bow, where you can see all the various chains for her anchors and various valve levers and so forth. Now, as we walk down towards the forwardmost 4.5-inch gun, you'll notice there is a small breakwater just there in the lower part of your screen, but not a tremendously large one. And just looking back up the bow, we can see there is a small amount of elevation there to help with seakeeping. There's Gannet and Ocelot there keeping an eye on her. And then we're going to move around here. The net obviously is not part of the breakwater. That's mostly there just to catch things or to give you something to hold on to in rough seas. But here is one of the 4.5-inch guns in its Mark V mounting. Taking a step back for a minute, you can see that blast deflector that's protecting A gun from the blast of B gun to a certain degree. Also, I may or may not have slightly tripped for the first time going over that rope netting, but, no video evidence, therefore it didn't happen. So as we go up to the gun mounting itself, you can see what might look like a turret from the front, but it's open-backed, so it is not, in fact, a turret, but it has been kept in absolutely remarkable condition. There's a little sighting hood there if you happen to need it, although to be fair, if you are using that, and that means a lot of things have gone wrong. So we can go around the other side, and you can see the doors to a ready-use locker, and another one over there, plus a hatchway into the superstructure of the ship. So here we can see the gun is ready to be loaded, and, well, a few seagulls have gotten in there, but, this was during lockdown. This is why this screen is there for when the ship is normally closed up. Visitors during the day obviously is tending to scare off the birds well enough to keep it nice and clean. But there you go. So that's the forward gun, and we're going to have a little bit of a closer look at that just now. See what all those brass labels and so forth were about. And if you notice on a video by video or shot by shot basis, the level of lighting seems to change and the amount of cloud in the sky seems to change. Well, it was quite windy and it's Britain, so the weather was changing approximately once every 5 minutes. So here is the starboard side of a gun. And here's a close-up of those little brass plaques. Now, this is something that I found quite interesting about Cavalier. Although there is information on most guns on most museum ships from obviously their time as original serving vessels, on Cavalier particularly on the 4.5-inch guns, these little brass instructional plaques are absolutely everywhere. The one on the bottom right is just some basic information about the weight of the gun, but you'll notice if you have this video turned to HD and or you zoom in, you can actually read the other two. They are full-on instructions on how to operate parts of the 4.5-inch mounting, you know, just in case somebody forgot and happens to need a bit of a refresher. And to keep water from coming into the mounting while the ship is ploughing through heavy seas, you can see here that part of the mounting includes this rather nifty little shield that's built onto the gun itself, although you can see it's bolted on so you can take it off. And that prevents the water from coming in. This is distinct from what you might see on some battleships where they have canvas bags for this purpose at various points, although some battleships also share this more solid and weatherproof shield, which is quite important because obviously, especially as the foremost gun, there is probably going to be a fair bit of water splashing on this thing as the ship moves through the water. The staff were then kind enough to open up this little hatchway, so let's have a look at what this is, shall we? Yeah, so this is the ready-use ammo locker. There we go. Now obviously those were just empty brass cartridges, whereas just inside that bit of superstructure you could see behind us there, they have a little display illustrating some of the different kinds of shells that were actually able to be fired from the 4.5-inch gun, because that bit of superstructure includes the ammunition hoist for B gun, the one that's directly above it, and so we thought we'd have a little bit of a look in there. I apologise for the fact my head is cut out a little bit of the next shot, but at the time I didn't realise that the camera zoom was quite so intense. Given the echo, I decided to overdub this, so you have a full built-up shell, just the casing there on the hoist, then you have a white phosphorus illumination round and a high explosive shell there. And of course, in great channel tradition, I found ammunition, so I had to pick it up. Believe it or not, it might only be a 4.5-inch round, but it's actually relatively hefty. Very dense, I think, more than anything else. So yeah, let's put the white phosphorus round back in place, shall we? And here you can see a bit more clearly how that shell would have been transported up this slide to that black area up in the top right, and then that would have been moved up into a position where the gunners on B gun could pick it up. The reason why this system doesn't run all the way down to the magazines is because, of course, this is in the open superstructure. There is a hoist also in this area which supplies the shells in the first place. There's then on the port side this, which is one of the ship's two remaining Bofors guns. This is a single Bofors 40mm mount on the port side of the bridge. And like much else on the ship, it's covered in these handy little labels, in this case telling you what it is, what some of these things should be doing, and, of course, on the back, a bit more information about the gun itself, this Mark 7 mount, for instance. The gun retains this manual gun sight, although, to be fair, by the time that this ship left service, if you were having to rely on this thing, something had clearly gone horribly, horribly wrong, but at least you can see how it would have been aligned had that needed to be a factor, and of course would have been somewhat more important in the earlier part of the ship's career, when similar systems would have been present on the anti-aircraft medium and light caliber weapons that were there on the ship at the time. Something else that you'll find in this area is the ship's steering position. And yes, it's a small room off on the port side in the main superstructure, and no, you can't see anything through those walls. So you might be thinking, well, why on earth would you do that? Well, a couple of reasons. One, there isn't such a steering position on the bridge, such as it is, and second, the reason for that is, well, it's a destroyer. If you have your navigating officer up there, well, he can tell where the ship's going, but your steering officer, well, there's going to be a lot of wind and rain and potentially waves drenching you, and the last thing you want if you're in the middle of a high-stakes battle is for the man on the wheel to be swept to the back of the bridge by a particularly intense wave. It also means that down here he has a modicum of splinter protection against near misses. So you head up one level, and here is the bridge itself. Now this, as I've mentioned in a few dry docks and actually used this footage in a few dry docks, illustrates why open bridges, especially on destroyers but also on larger ships, remained in vogue for as much time as they did. Because here you can see you've actually got a better view than an enclosed bridge, because this is just a tarp, so you don't have the the framing of windows and so forth. But as I pan round, you can see that on this destroyer bridge, when you're looking through what would effectively be the same kind of view as an enclosed bridge, you can only see a very small amount from the central command position. If I then go over to the edge, as now, even with the relatively limited field of view of a camera, you can immediately see that I can actually see far more just by moving a few steps forward, so that that view is effectively unobstructed, than I could earlier. And this is fundamentally why open bridges were used for such a long time. You've got a few little bits of glass there to stop spray and so forth. Yes, it would be rather uncomfortable in bad weather, and to be honest, in very good weather you'd also boil a little bit, but it offers a far superior sense of situational awareness. It's also one of the reasons why many officers didn't use the conning towers in their ships during battles, no matter how bad the weather might be. And then back under the top, you can see how restricted that view has suddenly become. And of course, if you're under air attack, well, anything above your head, good luck spotting incoming aircraft. And when you take a closer look at Cavalier's bridge, it offers an interesting juxtaposition of World War I tech and tech that goes as far forward in time as the 1970s. So you can see here some very old school wooden boxes and some original system mounted alongside some much newer devices, including that yellow phone down there. And this orange object here on the left is not in fact a 1970s washing machine or a containment for the world's first basketball. It is in fact a PPI indicator radar unit, which by its size, more apart from anything else, indicates to you that this is very definitely a post-war installation, but it's right there next to a good old-fashioned wooden cabinet of some description. And looking here from the position where the captain would be, you can see a whole range of communications devices. You've got the sound-powered voice pipes there on the left. You've got that yellow Bakelite phone there off on the right. Well, another one. You've got various buttons for communicating things directly by making buzzers and everything go off. But it also gives you some idea of just how complex even the bridge of a destroyer is. And obviously, as you can also see, there's a little bit of shielding there to keep all the sensitive electronics, well, most of them at least, under cover from spray. And so after a quick look up at this mast, which you'll recognise the vague design style of, this kind of square lattice type, is a much smaller version of what you can find on something like Belfast in her refitted condition, which is the condition she's in as a museum ship at the moment. It's time to head downstairs and see what else we can see. Now, in the upper superstructure, there might not seem to be too much of interest from a purely military standpoint. There's quarters like this for the senior officers, the captain, the wardrooms up here as well. So, you know, it's a good idea of getting what life is like aboard a ship. Very definitely worth a visit, but I'll leave most of that to the explorations of those of you who visit. As I said, one, leaving some things out for people to explore, and two, a fully narrated tour of the Cavalier would take well over an hour. But there's also this area, the Naffy, where there's a wide variety of, probably I would suggest slightly dated by this point, snacks, including wonderful chocolate creams. And then as we continue to descend, we have this. This is the Type 293 radar technical room, and this perhaps gives you some idea of why adding radar created so many top weight issues, especially for smaller ships, because it's not just the weight of the antenna up top, which you might think might not weigh too much, but trust me, when it's up on a mast it still affects stability somewhat, but you've also got all this stuff, and this is only a small amount of the stuff that's in the technical office. And of course, this isn't all the equipment that would be there. As with most museum ships, there's some stuff that was left, other stuff that they've managed to bring in, hence the slightly different paint jobs on some of this equipment. But also there are areas where there's space for equipment that would have been there in life, but has not been acquired yet by the museum for display, because a good chunk of that equipment would have been removed when the ship was decommissioned. But as we get further down into the hull, we come across this thing. Now, as you might be able to discern if you zoom in on some of the indicators, this is part of the fire control system for the main guns. Now, it's not the only part, and yes, even a ship as small as the destroyer did have, by this point, a fully functional electronic fire control system, although the RPC installation also helped with that. But yes, this is just one part of the system. Here is some of the rest of it. This is the Admiralty Fire Control Box Mark 10. This is, believe it or not, despite the fact, as you can see, it's a 2 to 3 man operation, actually a much reduced version of the Admiralty fire control tables that were present in larger ships like, say, HMS Vanguard and various other cruisers that were being built or refitted around about this time. And all of this is tucked away in a nice little compartment on the starboard side of the ship. And, well, this is yet another part of the fire control system that's in the same room. And as you can see, there's space for another 3 to 4 men to operate this part. So incorporating just the various bits I've shown you, you're already talking about at least 6 to 8 men crammed into this compartment, which, trust me, was... I mean, I'm not claustrophobic, but it was a relatively interesting fit for just me with my camera. Stopping myself bumping into some of these bits and pieces was quite the interesting challenge. So getting all the people in here necessary to operate the fire control systems, to operate the ship's guns, that would have been fun. Bearing in mind, obviously, you can see some of the elevations and everything that this system makes possible. And then through an even smaller hatch, which was just to the right of what you just saw and just to the left of the other main bank, was this thing. This is the hilariously poorly named Flyplane Predictor Mark V. Given that this is the anti-aircraft component of the fire control system, I think it probably should be enabled no flyplane, bad plane predictor, because the flyplane is the one thing you don't want your targets to do when it's being targeted by this thing. And as you can see, there's this whole guide to components. But yeah, this is not the predictor. This is just a very, very small part of the predictor. And nor is this the predictor, although again, it is part of it. This is looking through that small hatch that I mentioned. Now, this, despite the fact it looks something like a cross between a diesel punk and an atom punk server rack, is just one block of the predictor. Or more accurately, part of one block of the predictor, because here's the top part of it. And here's some of the rest of it. This system, which as I said is the anti-aircraft predictor system, is actually immensely larger than the surface fire control section, most of which is contained in the small compartment that we've just been in. And you can see the absolute nest and mess of wires just above it. And although this is quite substantial, this again is still only part of it. You can see more of the systems there ahead of us. On the other side of this thing, there's even more parts to the system. And if you squeeze down past all those racks, you come out at this bit, so the system is just to our left, or the main part of it. This is another part of the system. The kind of dome thing off to your right is a gyro stabilizer element to the unit, so this gives an absolute reference bearing for what the ship is doing, and therefore how the guns may be elevated in terms of pitch and roll and so forth relative to normal, which all has to be factored in for when the guns are being fired at aerial targets. And on the other side, as I said, on the other side of the rack, you've got even more labels for things. Some stuff is fairly obvious: sight elevations, corrections to lateral deflections, relative wind speed, gun wind bearing, gun vertical deflection, all of these kinds of things. And then you have others which, they make sense, but it's also quite hilarious to read the names of out of context. Future sight elevation, just in case you need to predict the future. To shoot down aircraft, which, to be fair, is actually quite legitimately what this thing is doing. It's predicting where the aircraft is going to be at a certain time and trying to work out where the shells from the guns are going to be at a certain time and make those two times and locations in the future match up together. Although also the idea of there being a small box containing a psychic sailor appeals to me to a degree. And here's a slightly better look at that gyro system. Now, of course, this is actually positioned near enough as can be done at the center of the ship's motion, because that makes its job a heck of a lot easier than being chucked around by being mounted at the bow or stern, which to a certain degree also dictates where the rest of these fire control systems have to be, because otherwise you have to start running cables and things all over the place, which of course on something very lively like a destroyer means that, amongst other things, is one of the reasons why the fire control system is relatively high in the ship, definitely above the waterline. Although there is also the fact that unlike a battleship or a cruiser, there's no armoured deck to put all these systems under, so you might as well have them somewhat higher, because, well, putting them lower in the ship isn't really going to do them all that much more in terms of protection. And of course the results that it comes up with are fed back to the guns via systems like this. So this is one of the auto fire control sections. You can see there's test functions for elevation and training on either side, but it's currently set to enable the automatic fire systems to take over control of the turrets, so people just need to feed it ammo. And all of that ammunition is noted here on these boards, which lot the ammunition has come from, and as you can see, the number of carts of ammunition that are being placed down in the magazines. Now, you saw me loading some empty brass casings back into the ready-use locker, but here's a look at the base of another cartridge. And as you can see here, this is a 4.5-inch Mark 3 to 5 compatible shell. This is in particular a Mark N11, and you can see various bits of information on there as well. And of course the primer right there in the middle. Now, having walked the ship end to end a couple of times, I was none the wiser as to where all the ammunition was actually coming from. Couldn't find any ladders going in any obvious directions until it was pointed out to me when I asked that there were a couple of these small innocuous hatches on the deck. A few of them, believe it or not, actually in a mess area. Lifting the hatches revealed a ladder, much like this one, and then descending that ladder actually takes you down into the destroyer's magazine. Or one of them at the very least. I apologise for the slightly fisheye lens effect and a little bit of camera shake, but this is me doing my very best with a handheld GoPro in one hand and a torch in the other, the battery on my stabilizer having failed. So yeah, this is actually what the 4.5-inch magazine, or a 4.5-inch magazine, looks like. You've got all these storage canisters where the shells would be stored, and more racks and rails where extra stuff can be stored there. But as you can see, it's not exactly the world's most open of spaces, and they do have a few of them here that have some shells loaded in. Obviously they are still inert, but it gives you an idea of what they would have looked like. So yeah, ammunition is safe unless it's dangerous. Now that would be passed on to power hoists, the instructions for which you can see here. As I said, Cavalier seems to be very prolific in its use of little operators' instructions and reminders, whether they be in plastic, enamel or brass, all over the ship. So it does actually help greatly when you're trying to understand what exactly each of these things do and how to use it. And you can see here that there are a variety of instructions. So you've got the hoist, which can be used with power. There's also a manual backup, so there's instructions for hoisting by hand. There's also instructions on using it to embark ammunition, i.e. if you're sending the ammunition back down the other way, and some instructions on maintenance to make sure it doesn't break. And so this is the upper end of the hoist system. So this is actually underneath B gun. So we were in this room earlier looking at the little rail that ran from this room up to B gun. So this is where the shells will pop up from the magazine. They then be transferred about 6 feet to our right, looking at this photo, to the slide rail system that we saw earlier. Or alternatively, they could be fed out of the door whilst the hatch is closed by a system like this. This is a little runner, so this is part of our flash type protection system, so you can feed the shell out of here without having the hatch open, and then it can be stored in one of the ready use lockers. Now, you've already seen me filling them, but here's a close-up in a bit more detail. So you can see this ready-use locker holds a total of 10 shells, and there's a similar ready-use locker just over on the other side of this part of the superstructure. So that's 20 rounds, which between the two is the equivalent to about 1.5 minutes of firing time. Now, that might be all right for seeing off a quick air attack or two, but that's not going to keep the guns firing for long enough in any kind of significant action. And that's why the hoist system is there with that little pass-through, so that you can have more shells being brought up even whilst these ones are being depleted. And yes, there are proximity fuse shells. This is an inert version of one, and as you can see, the head is made of a radar transparent material to allow the proximity fuse, or the radar activated proximity fuse, to operate properly. And to wrap up this brief tour, let's head aft. So firstly, you have the last remaining aft 4.5-inch gun, pretty similar to A and B turrets forward, so nothing spectacular to pick up on here, although it's pointing the other way. But then we have what replaced the aft torpedo launchers and the super-firing aft gun, the Squid launcher. Well, two of them actually. This is one, the other's just off to the right. And you can see it's got this little rail system for moving around the Squid charges, two of which you can see there. Now, Squid is a very interesting system. You've got Squid and Limbo, the successors to Hedgehog and more regular depth charges. Fundamentally, the problem in World War II was that depth charges were quite big and heavy, so individually they stood a fairly good chance of killing a submarine. But because they were big and heavy, they could either only be launched a short distance with K guns and Y guns, or rolled off of the back. This led to the slight issue that it meant to engage a submarine was also to lose it on your sonar, or ASDIC, as it was called by the British in the early days. And so they developed Hedgehog. So Hedgehog could be fired much further ahead because individually they were much lighter, but they relied on a pattern, and usually you'd try and get multiple direct contact detonations. One might do it for a small submarine, but with bigger, faster and stronger submarines you'd need multiple Hedgehog hits. It had the slight advantage obviously of allowing you to maintain your lock with your underwater sensor systems, but whereas a near miss with a depth charge stood a good chance of still doing significant damage to a submarine, a near miss with Hedgehog meant you did nothing. Now, what Squid allowed you to do was to fire a much larger charge. You compare the Hedgehog charges, which you can relatively easily pick up and sling over your shoulder one-handed, with these things, which need full-on rail systems to move around. And you can understand that, Squid would do an awful lot more damage. Limbo would do even more damage because it had an even larger charge, but on a relatively small vessel like a C-class in the early Cold War period, Squid was probably about the best you could hope to install. Now, you might notice the slightly offset pattern to the tubes there, and that's because, like Hedgehog, it is still throwing out a pattern of charges, although sonar acquisition has theoretically improved, so has the escape and evasion abilities of submarines. So what you're effectively doing is trading off the number of charges in a Hedgehog launcher for fewer but more powerful charges with Squid. In this case, you obviously could volley fire 6, and those tubes can be adjusted in their aim. You don't have to aim the entire destroyer. And then Limbo, you have 3, and they're even more powerful still, so relying on the somewhat greater accuracy of newer sonar systems. But ultimately, these kinds of systems would be superseded by a combination of homing torpedoes that ships could launch, missiles that could drop homing torpedoes, like the Ikara system, and, of course, helicopters, which could take any form of weapon system, whether that be a depth charge or a homing torpedo, and just drop it very far away from you. Because, of course, if you're in launch range to a submarine, the submarine's probably in launch range to you. And speaking of things that launch, here's that Seacat system. It's better than a kick to the face, I suppose. It was never the world's most reliable anti-aircraft missile system, but it was something that could be relatively easily dropped in place and didn't weigh too much. And it was better than Sea Slug, at least. Although, as you can see, the presence of an aerial threat there in the top right does suggest that, this system is very much out of date and out of action. You can't actually reach the Seacat, at least at the time that I was there. This is about the closest you're going to get one deck down from it. They may have opened up more of the superstructure since, so you may be able, for example, to venture out from the aft superstructure that you can see just forward of us and forward of the launcher and have a look at it on the level, but this was the closest I could get on the day. Then again, as a post-1950s missile system, I'm just looking and going, yeah, it has fins, it's missile-like, it go whoosh, theoretically plane explode, but probably not. And as mentioned before, Cavalier now rests in the place that HMS Victory was launched from many years ago, although as the notice here obviously states, this is not the exact original dock. This is the number 2 dock. The old single dock, which is the one the Victory was in, was on this particular site, but in the 19th century it was replaced by the current dock. So right location, not 100% accurate to 250 years ago, shockingly enough. But also, as mentioned, Cavalier is the official memorial to all those ships and men lost from the Royal Navy's destroyers during the Second World War. This is part of the memorial, and you can see there are quite a few destroyers listed there. So with that, careful memory noted, we shall ring ourselves off the ship and end the video. Now, of course, the video wouldn't have been possible without the very kind assistance, help and permission to both board the ship and film it, which all came from the Chatham Historic Dockyard. So, as I said at the beginning, please, if you can, go and give the dockyard a visit. They've got a lot of different things to look through, and they host a number of special events as well. At the time that this video is being released, a week and a half prior, they were actually holding a gaming convention in the covered dockyard sheds, which are just off to the right of this picture. So yeah, very definitely worth a look. There's history going all the way back to its founding in the Tudor period. Then you've got the wreck of the 1700s HMS Invincible, the museum for that. You've got the ropery, which some of you will have seen in the previous video I did on Chatham Dockyard. You've got dockyard trains, you've got Cavalier, you've got Ocelot, you've got Gannet, and the covered sheds, where there's a whole load more interesting naval history. And of course, shout out to Lawries Mechanical Marvels, the channel who actually had closer contacts with Chatham than I did, and was able to arrange as a liaison and go-between between the two of us. So take a look at his channel if you like all things mechanical as well. And that's it.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.